The latest demonstrations in Sudan have been reported as the bloodiest yet, bringing the total of civilian deaths to over 50 since the October 25 coup. According to the Sudan Doctors Committee, many of the protesters were shot in the head or chest. Security forces were shooting to kill, not to disperse the protests. The security forces' willingness to use lethal force on unarmed civilians has only deepened public antipathy of the military. Before General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan seized power, he was already the most powerful man in Sudan, head of Sudan's Sovereign Council, and the face of the army in the country's civilian-military power-sharing arrangement. So why did he feel the need to implement a coup? Firstly, according to the power-sharing agreement, General Burhan was due to step down as chairman of the Sovereign Council in November. At that point, a civilian chosen by the Forces for Freedom and Change, a loose coalition of civilian groups, would have become the new head of state. In this scenario, civilians in government would be better placed to push ahead with their agenda. This agenda includes accountability for human rights violations. The disbanded government is committed in principle to handing over ex-President Bashir to the International Criminal Court, whereas his former lieutenants, such as General Burhan and General Mohammed Hamdan Hemeti Dagalo, leader of the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, want him tried in Sudan. Both men have reason to fear that Bashir will name them as culprits in the atrocities of the Dafur war. Atrocities were also committed in Khartoum in June 2019, 2 months after Bashir's removal, when peaceful protesters were calling for civilian rule. Both General Burhan and General Hemeti are implicated in this massacre and will fear any investigation. Furthermore, in the run-up to the coup, Prime Minister Hamdok had been increasingly vocal in his criticism of the military's dominance in the economy. For example, the army commanding a vast share of the national budget, military-owned companies operating with tax exemptions, corrupt contracting procedures, and so on. The plan in the next stage of the transitional period was to place the army under proper civilian control. So we can see that General Burhan had multiple motivations for staging the coup. From the other side, unlike other African countries experiencing coups, the Sudanese public has a long tradition of non-violent protests and possesses organizational structures allowing protesters to sustain these efforts, as described by the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Dating back to 2013 are resistance committees, grassroots civil society organizations that are a distinctive feature of Sudan's political landscape and play a role in mobilizing opposition, including organizing marches, building street barricades, and debating political strategy. Since the October 25 coup, there have been rolling pro-democracy protests across the country under the banner "No negotiations, no compromise, no power sharing with the military." These volunteer groups were vital to the uprising that toppled dictator Omar al-Bashir, and their sustained pressure forced the military to agree to the initial power-sharing transitional government. Now they are demanding that the military get out of politics and return to the barracks. As Sudanese political analyst Khaloud Kher said to the New Humanitarian, "The resistance committees have made it clear that their main concern is to call for full civilian rule. Until that is established, they will continue to protest." Former Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok suffered sustained house arrest during the coup and was then wheeled out in some attempt to add legitimacy to the ruling military. But this was such a poorly conceived effort that it simply angered the public even further. In addition, following the Hamdok deal, 12 civilian ministers from the Forces of Freedom and Change resigned their positions. From the cabinet that existed before the coup, only 2 ministers remain, and they are both in custody. The latest news is that Hamdok has resigned, leaving the ruling military without any legitimacy whatsoever. A Sudanese lawyer and legal commentator, Ahmed El Ghaili, said to Al Jazeera, "His removal, as far as protesters are concerned, removes the last fig leaf that was covering this regime, and what remains is a full-fledged military dictatorship." There have been worrying signs. The military have been attempting to replace civilian officials with notable figures from the Bashir regime, including Islamists, showing that they are aligning with that dictatorial era. They also fired many prominent bankers, then pressured the central bank to transfer funds to accounts controlled by the military, according to the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, revitalizing this predatory style of government. Following the coup, major donors such as the World Bank suspended its aid to Sudan, with the US freezing $700 million in aid. The democratic international community has been unanimous in condemning the coup. This poses massive economic challenges to the military regime. Only with a civilian government will Sudan attract the international capital that it needs to rebuild its damaged economy. Having taken over the country, the military now owns its economic burdens. With both sides entrenched, it is hard to see a way forward. The military leaders have strong motivation to keep civilians out of power, for fear that they will be held accountable for their past crimes. However, the pro-democracy protesters are well organized and motivated, and by some accounts capable of crippling the country. Add to this picture Sudan's huge economic challenges, and it really is a melting pot. Most likely is further entrenchment of the two sides, with more protester deaths sadly inevitable.